My father's business dinners had always been the kind of events where people believed success was something you could measure by the thickness of a steak and the price of a watch. Morton's Steakhouse in downtown Boston smelled of expensive bourbon and ambition. The lights were low, the laughter was polished, and every handshake looked rehearsed. I paused at the entrance for a moment, taking in the crowd of dark suits and sequined dresses. Then I straightened my white blouse, smoothed my black slacks, and walked in. My outfit looked plain next to the others, but it was what I wore when I worked. Comfortable, clean, no pretense. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Dad saw me before I reached the table. His expression stiffened for half a second before he forced a smile. "Clara," he said, standing to greet me. "You made it. I said I would." He gave a small laugh, the kind people make when they're trying to sound proud but aren't. "Everyone, this is my daughter Clara Mitchell. She's finding her way in her career right now." The words hung in the air. A few polite smiles circled the table. One man nodded slowly, like he was offering condolences. I forced a small grin. "Actually, I run a software company," I said. "We develop logistics optimization systems for—" Dad cut me off with an easy chuckle. "She works around warehouses. That kind of thing." My stomach tightened. "We don't work in warehouses. We help them run efficiently." He waved a hand like it was all the same. "It's complicated. Let's not bore everyone with supply chains." Mom looked down at her napkin, pretending to rearrange it. My sister Olivia tilted her wine glass toward me, eyes glinting. Olivia always knew how to make an entrance. Tonight she wore a sapphire blue dress, a pearl necklace that caught every light in the room, and a smile that could slice through glass. "Casual Friday came early, huh?" she said lightly. I took the empty seat beside her. "I'm right on time." She leaned closer, still smiling. Being on time doesn't mean you're in the right place. The words landed sharper than she intended. Or maybe exactly as she intended. I looked straight ahead and let out a quiet breath. Around us, the table buzzed with conversation about IPOs, interest rates, and property markets. Dad laughed with his old college friend, someone who ran a hedge fund. He'd always admired people in suits who used words like liquidity and diversify. I'd learned years ago that the only thing he found impressive was other men's approval. A waiter poured wine into my glass. I thanked him and focused on the hum of voices, the sound of silverware. For a few minutes, no one asked me anything, which was almost a relief, until one of the men turned toward me. "So, Clara," he said with a polite smile, "your dad says you work in logistics. What does that mean exactly? You drive trucks." Before I could answer, Dad chuckled again. "She helps warehouses keep track of boxes or something like that. It's entry-level logistics work." I felt heat crawl up my neck. "That's not what I do," I said softly. "I own the company." "Oh," the man replied, surprised but still smiling. "What's it called? ClearPath Systems." He nodded vaguely, probably already forgetting the name. Someone else laughed quietly. Across the table, Olivia twirled her fork. "You must get so tired dealing with forklifts and barcodes." I met her eyes. "Sometimes. But it's satisfying watching something complicated run smoothly." The man next to Dad leaned back. "Warehouse queen, huh?" he joked. I set my fork down and smiled. "If that's the title, then yes. I run the whole kingdom." A few chuckles circled the table. Some uncomfortable, some genuinely amused. Dad cleared his throat and turned the conversation back to a stock tip someone had mentioned earlier. I let it go. I'd learned long ago that arguing with him in front of his friends was like shouting into the wind. Still, the sting settled somewhere deep, the same dull ache that came every time he pretended not to understand what I'd built. He didn't have to believe in me, but pretending I was invisible hurt in ways I couldn't name. I sipped my wine and glanced around. Mom was watching me with that half-apologetic, half-helpless look she always wore when Dad talked over me. Olivia was scrolling through her phone, probably checking social media for pictures of herself. Then, from across the table, David Ross, the family's longtime attorney and one of Dad's closest friends, spoke up. Clear path systems, you said? Yes, I answered. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and began typing. The light from the screen reflected off his glasses. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then I saw his expression change. The casual interest disappeared. His eyebrows lifted slightly, his mouth parting in quiet surprise. He looked from the screen to me, then to Dad, then back to me again. Dad noticed. What he asked? David didn't answer right away. Nothing, he said, finally slipping the phone face down onto the table. Just thought the name sounded familiar. I didn't push it. I just held his gaze for half a second and gave a faint, knowing smile. Inside, I felt the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Quiet, controlled, almost invisible. Not because he'd found something that might finally prove my worth, but because for once someone had bothered to look. I lifted my glass, taking another sip, my voice steady inside my head. They only believe when they see proof. The laughter continued around me. The conversations moved on, but for the first time that evening I didn't feel small. I just sat there listening, waiting. And in that waiting something shifted. The night had only just begun to turn. 5 years earlier I had nothing but an idea, and the certainty that I wasn't going to live the kind of life my father had already written for me. It was the summer of 2019, and Stanford's campus shimmered in the heat. My decision to drop out came down in one ugly phone call. "Are you out of your mind?" Dad's voice thundered through the line from Boston. "No one invests in a dropout." "Then I'll invest in myself," I said. "You think stubbornness is the same as courage? You're throwing away your future. Maybe it's my future to throw away." There was silence for a moment. Then the line went dead. I didn't expect him to understand. To him, success came with titles, not ideas. That winter, Olivia's wedding filled the ballroom of a 5-star hotel in Back Bay. White roses, crystal chandeliers, and a string quartet that played too loudly. I sat in the 3rd row wearing a simple navy dress that already felt out of place among the sequins. When the master of ceremonies introduced the brilliant, accomplished sister, my father took the microphone. "One of my daughters has made me very proud," he said, smiling at the groom's family. The room laughed politely, and I felt every chuckle like a pinprick. I raised my glass, pretended to sip, and stepped back toward the wall where no one noticed me. The bride's bouquet caught the light like a flashbulb. I watched Olivia dance with Dad to Sinatra and thought, I'll never be part of this picture. I learned how to smile even when nothing was funny. By 2020, I was living in Brooklyn in a tiny studio apartment that smelled faintly of paint and coffee. My desk was an old dining table I'd found on Craigslist. Marcus Lee. My co-founder worked beside me most nights, both of us hunched over laptops, code spilling across the screens. We had 3 clients. The biggest one paid in installments. Our revenue for the year wouldn't break 6 figures, but it didn't matter. We were building something real, something people needed. One night around 2 a.m, Marcus looked up from his monitor. "You think your dad will ever get it?" "Probably not," I said, still typing. "He should. You're doing something no one else has the guts to do." I smiled faintly. "I don't need him to understand, as long as the clients do." By 2021, ClearPath Systems had moved into a small office in a converted warehouse off Kent Avenue. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. We hung a whiteboard on the wall and wrote our goals in black marker: 10 clients. 1 major partnership. Profit by Q4. I worked 14-hour days, slept 6. On weekends, I walked through real warehouses, talking to managers, asking about their bottlenecks, their headaches, their inefficiencies. I'd come home with grease on my hands and ideas filling every inch of my brain. Every Christmas, Dad sent a group email to the family with a photo of Olivia and her husband in Aspen. "So proud of our girl's promotion," it would say. He never mentioned me. Mom sometimes called to check in, her voice small caught between us. "Your father's just old-fashioned," she'd whisper. "He'll come around. He doesn't need to." I'd answer, "I already did." In March 2022, ClearPath landed its first real contract, a national furniture retailer with 50 distribution centers. I drafted the press release myself and sent it to Dad's office inbox. The subject line read, "Your daughter's company just did something big." Days passed. No reply. When I called the house, Mom answered. "He's been busy with work," she said. "I'll tell him you called." I knew she wouldn't. Spring came and went. We expanded to 12 employees, raised a seed round, and moved into a bigger space. Every step forward felt like a quiet rebellion against everything my family thought I couldn't do. But the silence from Boston stayed the same. Thanksgiving 2023 was the first time I didn't go home. Marcus and I ordered takeout Chinese and toasted with cheap champagne under the hum of the office lights. "To the people who believe in us," he said. I clinked my glass against his. "And to the ones who don't." Still, every now and then I caught myself waiting. For an email, a text, some sign that Dad had noticed. It never came. Late one night in January 2024, I was going through invoices when my phone buzzed. A notification flashed, no response from Clara Mitchell. The automatic follow-up from my email client reminding me that the message I'd sent 3 weeks ago was still unread. I stared at it for a long time, the glow of the screen washing over my hands. Then I hit delete. A strange calm settled over me. I leaned back in my chair and whispered to the empty room, "It's fine. One day they won't be able to ignore me." The radiator clicked softly in the corner. The city noise faded into the background, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the quiet before something big. By July of 2025, ClearPath was weeks away from closing our Series C round. The valuation, $1.6 billion, wasn't just a number, it was the validation of 6 years of relentless work. We were on the edge of everything I had dreamed of when the story broke. It started as a short post on an industry blog, FreightSync Solutions. Our biggest rival claimed ClearPath had inflated its carbon efficiency data to attract investors. Within hours, it spread to every major financial outlet. By afternoon, TechLedger ran a headline that made my stomach drop. "Is ClearPath cooking the numbers?" I was in the middle of a product demo when Marcus stormed into the conference room, laptop under his arm. "Turn on CNBC," he said. On screen, a talking head discussed the potential discrepancies in ClearPath's sustainability reports. "Jesus," he muttered. "If we don't respond now, they'll write the story for us." The rest of the team gathered around. Emma, our operations manager, was pale. "One of our biggest clients just called," she said quietly. "They're pausing the renewal until this gets cleared up." The words hit me like a cold wave. "Which client?" "National Supply. The one that covers 20% of our annual revenue." For a moment, no one spoke. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the sound of traffic outside. "Okay," I said finally. "We're not going to panic. We'll release a statement, show the audit logs, make it boringly factual, then..." Marcus shook his head. "Boring doesn't trend. FreightSync's CEO is already doing interviews calling us unethical." "She's desperate," I said. "Their numbers have been slipping for a year." He leaned forward. "Clara, if we don't make noise, the market will assume she's right." I looked at him. "We don't need to shout. We just need to prove it." That night I called an emergency meeting with our board over Zoom. Faces lined up on the screen. Our investors' legal counsel, communications consultant. Everyone talking at once, everyone afraid. Our PR advisor said, "If this goes to CNN or the Journal, you need a spokesperson ready." "I'll speak," I said. "You're too close to it," one investor warned. "Let someone else front the story," Marcus added. "She built the damn company. Who else should speak?" Silence followed. After the call, I stayed alone in the office, lights off, city lights flickering through the glass. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the number until I heard his voice. "Clara." My father. Always formal, like we weren't related. "I saw the news." This is what happens when you chase attention instead of stability. I almost laughed. "I didn't chase anything, Dad. We built something that works." He sighed heavily. "You're playing in a world you don't understand. When things fall apart, don't say I didn't warn you." Maybe I'd rather things fall apart than spend my life inside someone else's rules. He didn't respond. The line clicked dead. I set the phone down and stared at the skyline of Brooklyn, the Manhattan Bridge glowing in the distance. The city always looked most alive when people thought it was sleeping. At 10 the next morning, Emma knocked on my office door holding her phone. CNN Business wants to talk, she said. About what I asked, though, I already knew. They're doing a segment on transparency in tech. A producer named Jenna Cole emailed. She wants to interview you about the allegations. Marcus followed her in. No, absolutely not. Once it's on TV, they'll cut it however they want. You could say the sky is blue and they'll edit it into a confession. I rubbed my forehead. If we hide it, looks like guilt. He folded his arms. You're not hiding. You're being strategic. I'm being honest, I said. There's a difference. Marcus exhaled, frustrated. You're risking everything we built. I'm protecting it, I answered quietly. If I don't speak, the only voice the world hears is hers. The office was silent except for the faint hum of computers. I typed a short email back to Jenna. Happy to speak. Let me know your schedule. When I hit send, Marcus shook his head, but didn't argue again. The rest of the day blurred into calls and spreadsheets, our comms team collecting proof of compliance every file we'd ever archived. But none of it stopped the headlines. Each hour, a new article appeared, twisting the same story. That night I stayed late again. Most of the team had gone home. I walked to the window, the city spread below like an endless grid of possibility and doubt. I could see my reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, the faint glow of monitors behind me. For the first time since the scandal started, I let myself feel it. The fear, the anger, the exhaustion of being questioned, not for what I'd done, but for daring to succeed where no one expected me to. Down on the streetcar, headlights slid across puddles, scattering silver light up the walls. My breath fogged the glass. When people call you a fraud, I thought you can't fight them with noise. You fight them with truth. And the only way to prove what's real is to show it to the world one brutal inch at a time. The morning the CNN crew arrived, the office didn't feel like mine anymore. Wires ran across the floor lights on stands, threw harsh shadows against the glass walls, and a boom mic hung over the main desk like a dark cloud. My team tried to keep working, pretending not to notice the cameras, but the tension sat thick in the air. Marcus stood by the window, gnawing at his thumbnail. They brought 3 cameras, he whispered. Why do they need 3? Maybe they're expecting me to run, I said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Want one? He shook his head. You're too calm. It's freaking me out. I've been nervous before, I said. This isn't that. A woman with a headset approached. We're ready for you in 5 minutes. Ms. Mitchell, Jenna will start with some background questions. Got it, I said, taking a sip of coffee. It was lukewarm bitter. Perfect. They set me up in the conference room. The backdrop was our logo. Blue and white, simple, clean. Behind me, through the glass wall, you could see part of the operations floor screens, displaying live data from hundreds of warehouses across the country. I wanted that in frame. I wanted the truth of what we built visible, even when I wasn't speaking. Jenna Cole entered a few minutes later. She was mid-30s, sharp eyes, calm voice. She smiled as she sat down across from me. Thank you for agreeing to talk, Clara. I know this week hasn't been easy. I returned the smile. I don't expect easy. I expect real. The cameras rolled. A red light blinked. She glanced at her notes. ClearPath has raised more than $200 million in funding over the last 3 years. Some people say young startups exaggerate to get that kind of attention. What do you say to them? I met her eyes. Startups don't exaggerate. We believe in things before everyone else does. That belief is what builds the future. Jenna nodded slowly. Still, the allegations about your carbon efficiency data have raised concerns. Did your team inflate the numbers? No, I said simply. We measure exactly what happens in real time. We can prove it, and we have. Our audits are public. She paused. Some claim you're just the face of ClearPath, that others run the real show behind you. A small smile tugged at my mouth. I wrote the first line of code that became this system. I hired every engineer on that floor. I'm not the face of anything. I'm the architect. The room went still. Somewhere behind the cameras, someone cleared their throat. Jenna leaned back. That's a strong statement. It's a true one. The next questions were softer. About growth leadership challenges as a woman in a male-dominated industry. I answered honestly without rehearsing. I told her how many nights I'd spent on warehouse floors counting inventory, understanding the rhythm of logistics before trying to automate it. While we spoke, the camera operators shifted angles. Through the glass, I saw Emma leading one of them through the data center, pointing out our dashboards. She looked proud, her ponytail bouncing as she walked. The tension that had filled the room earlier began to ease. Jenna closed her notebook. You talk a lot about transparency, she said. Why risk doing this interview instead of waiting for the noise to fade? Because silence lets lies breathe, I said. And because my team deserves better than rumors. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. Then she gave a small, approving nod. That might be the best answer I've heard this week. When we finished, the crew packed up quickly, filling the office with the sound of zippers and shifting equipment. Marcus reappeared at my side as they unplugged cables. How'd it go? He asked. Fine, I said. Fine. He frowned. You just told CNN you wrote the first line of code. You probably gave them their headline. I looked out toward the main floor. My team was returning to their desks, the relief visible on their faces. Good, I said. Then they'll finally know who actually builds things in this city. Jenna walked over her blazer, slung over one arm. Thank you again, Clara. The segment will air during prime time on Thursday. I think a lot of people will see themselves in your story. If it helps them understand what real work looks like, I said, then it's worth it. She smiled. It will. Then she and her crew left, the sound of their footsteps fading down the hall. For a long while after they were gone, the office stayed unusually quiet. No one said much. The hum of the servers filled the space where nerves had been. I walked back to my desk, set down my coffee, and turned to the main display wall. On the screens, hundreds of colored lines pulsed across the map, each representing a shipment moving through our network, each updated in real time. At the bottom of the screen, a number glowed softly: 120 warehouses online. I let my hand rest against the glass of the nearest screen. Numbers don't lie. People can. The city outside was moving as always, unaware of what had just happened here. I watched the reflection of my face fade into the glow of data and thought, whatever happens when this airs, at least the truth will have its own voice now. 2 weeks later, my mother called while I was in the middle of a meeting. Her voice came through the speaker, soft and hesitant, the way it always did when she was trying to talk me into something I didn't want to do. Clara, your father's hosting another business dinner next Saturday, she said. He wants you to come? I almost laughed. He wants me there, or you want me there? A pause. He thinks it would be good for you to reconnect. For all of us. Reconnect. After he told a national audience, I was ruining my life. He didn't mean it that way, she said quietly. He just doesn't understand. Maybe he will if he sees you again. Please, sweetheart. He needs to know you're still part of this family. There it was. The word family, her favorite currency. I wanted to say no, to tell her that the only family that mattered was the one I'd built in Brooklyn. But the way she said, please, made something in me soften. I'll come, I said finally. Saturday night in Boston was humid and heavy. The restaurant was the same one where Dad had hosted every quarterly dinner since I was a teenager, a place full of mahogany oil paintings and men who thought success was something you could pour into a glass. I arrived 5 minutes late. The hostess recognized me and led me toward the private dining room. The closer I got, the louder the laughter became. When I stepped inside, the room turned just long enough for people to assess what I was wearing: a black silk blouse, gray slacks, no jewelry. I could practically hear them calculating how much it cost, and deciding it wasn't enough. Dad was standing near the head of the table, deep in conversation with a group of investors. When he saw me, his face didn't change. "Good," he said, nodding once. "You made it." "Hi, Dad." He gestured toward an empty chair between my mother and Olivia. "Sit. We were just talking about market corrections." "Of course you were," I murmured, taking my seat. Olivia was glowing as always, hair perfectly curled, gold earrings catching the light. She smiled the kind that wasn't really a smile. So she said, turning toward me, "Is it true your billion-dollar company still rides around in that old Subaru I didn't flinch?" "That car's never broken down on me," I said. "Can't say the same about certain people." Her eyes narrowed. "Still so defensive. Still so predictable," I replied and focused on the menu. The waiter poured wine. Small talk filled the air: IPOs, interest rates, tax strategies. I recognized every voice, every smug laugh. I'd been here before, just a background character at my father's table. Mom leaned toward me. "You look tired," she whispered. "Working," I said simply. "Well, maybe this weekend you can relax. No emails, no warehouses." I smiled faintly. "I'll try." Dinner began, plates arriving in waves. Steaks, scallops, side dishes arranged like exhibits. Conversation drifted around the table. No one asked me about ClearPath. It was as if I didn't exist. Halfway through the meal, one of Dad's associates turned to him. "Richard, remind me, what does your younger daughter do again?" Dad hesitated. Knife in hand. "She's still trying to get her business off the ground. A startup of some kind." A ripple of polite amusement went around the table. My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. Then, David Ross, the attorney who'd once looked up my company name at another dinner months ago, spoke up from across the table. "A startup of some kind," he said. "I'm pretty sure I just saw that company featured on CNN last week." The room stilled for a heartbeat. Dad frowned. "What are you talking about? ClearPath Systems," David said. "They were profiling companies that are redefining logistics. Sounded familiar since that's your daughter's company, right?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Dad gave an uncertain laugh. "You must be mistaken." David shook his head. "No, I'm not." And then, as if the universe was waiting for its cue, the large TV mounted in the corner flickered to life. The restaurant staff had switched the channel to CNN Business, probably to impress the guests with the stock ticker running at the bottom of the screen. The broadcast came in mid-sentence. Tonight on CNN Business, the anchor said the story of a young CEO who's redefining the logistics industry across America, Clara Mitchell of ClearPath Systems. The footage cut to me sitting in our Brooklyn office speaking to Jenna Cole. The entire table fell silent. Forks stopped mid-air, wine glasses hovered. On the screen I was saying startups don't exaggerate. They believe in what others can't see yet. That's how innovation begins. Olivia's hand tightened around her glass. "Oh my God," she whispered. The camera showed my face close up, calm, composed, confident. Behind me, the ClearPath logo gleamed. "That's you," one of the guests murmured to Dad. "She's on CNN. I could feel everyone's eyes on me now. Dad's, Olivia's, Mom's." Every laugh from earlier had evaporated. The segment kept playing. My voice filled the room. I wrote the first line of code that built this company. I'm not the face of it. I'm the architect. The anchor's voice came over the footage. ClearPath Systems has quickly become the market leader in warehouse optimization, now valued at $1.6 billion. Someone at the table coughed to break the silence. Dad stared at the TV, his jaw locked. "That's..." He started but couldn't finish. I set my napkin down and looked directly at him. "That's the company I run, Dad. The one I told you about." He blinked as if seeing me for the first time. "Why didn't you tell me it was this big?" I did, I said softly. "You just never listened." The screen faded to commercial, leaving a stunned quiet behind. The hum of the restaurant returned. Distant laughter, clinking glasses from other tables. But at ours, no one moved. I looked around the table at the men who had smirked earlier at my sister staring into her untouched wine at my mother's trembling hands. The silence felt cleaner than applause. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and sat back in my chair, letting the moment breathe. For once, no one had anything left to say. Olivia was the first to break the silence. Her voice trembled thin as glass. That's you. I looked at her calm. Yes, that's me. Across the table, David Ross nodded slowly. CNN just aired the interview, he said to the room. ClearPath Systems valued at $1.6 billion. Someone near the end of the table turned to my father. "Richard, you didn't know." My father's mouth opened like he might laugh, but no sound came. His smile faltered halfway. "Of course No, I didn't realize." His voice trailed off. The muscles in his jaw worked as he tried to process what was happening. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip, letting the tension hang where it was. "Yes," I said finally. "That's my company." The television behind us was still playing. The anchor's voice carried across the table, cutting through the uncomfortable quiet. Independent auditors have confirmed ClearPath's full transparency in reporting. Claims of data manipulation appear to be part of a competitive smear campaign orchestrated by FreightSync Solutions. The guests shifted in their chairs. A few murmured under their breath. Somewhere in the room, someone started clapping softly. 1, 2, 3 hesitant beats, before others joined in just enough to make the air vibrate. Olivia looked down at her lap, her shoulders tight. My mother stared at the screen, hand pressed against her throat like she couldn't breathe properly. My father stayed frozen, his fingers locked around his wineglass. I could feel his shame before he spoke. No one had to say anything. The truth was louder than all of them. Inside my head, the words came quietly like a whisper only I could hear. In this room, nobody needed to shout. The truth spoke for itself. The broadcast kept going. The screen showed clips of me walking through the office with Jenna Cole, footage of our engineers' warehouses, alive with movement. I could hear my own voice steady and sure. Success isn't about titles. It's about solving problems that matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had spent his life chasing titles. When the segment ended, the CNN logo faded out, replaced by muted commercials. The glow of the television cast soft light over the table, painting everyone in blue and gold. No one moved. Finally, my father turned toward me. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Why didn't you say it was this big?" I met his eyes. "I did tell you. You just never listened." He blinked hard as if that might change what he'd just heard. "You can't expect me to believe," I interrupted gently. "I don't need you to believe anything. You can turn on the TV if you want proof." The room went still again. Across from me, Olivia whispered something I couldn't catch. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was disbelief. It didn't matter. One of the men who'd been laughing earlier tried to smooth things over. "Well, Richard, it looks like you raised quite the entrepreneur." His tone was light, but his eyes flicked between us nervously. My father managed a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Apparently so. The waiter reappeared to clear the plates, but no one touched their food. The only sound was the clink of dishes and the low hum of other diners outside the private room, their laughter muffled behind the door. I glanced at my mother. She gave me a faint, watery smile, the kind that said everything and nothing at once. I nodded back, grateful and sad all at once. The silence pressed in. It wasn't heavy anymore, just hollow. All the years of disbelief, the dismissive jokes, the quiet condescension, they had collapsed under the weight of one televised truth. My father exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down a little too hard. "You should have told me directly." "I tried," I said softly. "You just kept changing the subject." He stared down at the tablecloth. "Maybe I didn't want to hear it. Maybe you didn't," I said. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. The waiter came back to refill the glasses, his hands trembling slightly from the tension. Nobody touched their drinks. For a long moment, we just sat there, the light from the TV flickering across our faces. I didn't feel angry anymore or triumphant. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes after you've spent years shouting into a storm only to realize you never needed to raise your voice at all. Then softly, my father said, "I suppose this means I owe you an apology." I didn't answer. Because in that moment, the apology wasn't for me. It was for himself. The glow from the television dimmed as the commercial ended. A new program began, the sound fading into background noise. My father's gaze dropped to the table, the wineglass still trembling between his fingers. The light from the TV flickered once more, catching the side of my face. I sat still, expression calm, the quiet hum of conversation resuming in distant parts of the restaurant. He stayed that way. Head bowed, silent, as the color from the screen painted us both in silver, and I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. By the next morning, the interview had gone everywhere. My name sat on headlines, LinkedIn posts, Twitter threads, business newsletters. The same people who once ignored my emails now tagged me with words like visionary and self-made. The title that followed me across every screen made me laugh quietly to myself. Clara Mitchell, the CEO her father never believed in. I didn't need them to believe. I just needed them to stop pretending I didn't exist. By 9 a.m., ClearPath's inbox overflowed with partnership requests. Our site traffic spiked 500%. Marcus sent me a text. "We're trending under #ClearPathTruth." But while the internet buzzed, a very different morning played out in Boston. My father walked into his office at Mitchell Investments, coffee in hand, the same routine he'd repeated for 20 years. Except this time, the room felt smaller. His assistant looked up, nervous smile hovering. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell? Congratulations, I guess." He blinked. "For what, your daughter's CNN feature. Everyone's talking about it." He muttered something under his breath, brushing past her into his office. The door closed behind him, but the whispers didn't. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. A message from one of his longtime golf buddies. "Didn't you once say your kid was running a warehouse? Looks like she's running Wall Street instead." Another text followed. "You might want to update your bragging rights, Rich." He stared at the screen, the heat rising in his face. Then came the email from the Private Investors Forum, a thread titled "ClearPath Systems. New unicorn led by 29-year-old female CEO." Someone had commented beneath it, "Funny, I remember Richard Mitchell saying she was between jobs." He shut his laptop and sat back, staring at nothing. Every careless thing he'd ever said about me echoed in his head sharper now because the world had turned up the volume. Across the city, my sister was having her own reckoning. Olivia's office in downtown Chicago was sleek, all glass and mirrors, reflecting her perfectly polished image back at her. Her assistant knocked gently on the door. "Olivia, there's an email you should see." She clicked the screen. A client she'd been courting for weeks had written, "Given your public comments on startups, we've decided to go in a different direction." Attached was a link to one of her old posts. "Most startups are just fancy dreams for people afraid of real work." The irony hit her before the regret did. She scrolled down the comments. Someone had replied, "Tell that to your sister on CNN last night." Olivia leaned back in her chair, hands trembling slightly. The world she'd built around appearances was cracking, and she didn't even have to touch it to hear the sound. Meanwhile, in New York, I was at the office reviewing a new client proposal when my mother called. "They've been playing your interview all morning," she said. Her voice was lighter than it had been in years. "Even the local news picked it up. Your father's quiet today." "Quiet's new for him," I said. "I think he's embarrassed." "He should be," I said softly. Then caught myself. "No, he should be learning." Mom hesitated, then whispered, "You know I watched the interview twice. When you said I just wanted to build something real, I realized we never asked what that really meant." I smiled faintly. It means I build things that last longer than approval." She laughed under her breath. "I think you get that from me." Later that evening, my father sat in his study at home. The TV glowed quietly in the corner, replaying my interview. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching me speak. When I said I just wanted to build something real, he pressed pause. The screen froze on my face. He stared at it for a long time before whispering almost to himself, "I never asked what she was building." The next morning at the monthly investor roundtable, my father arrived early. The usual chatter filled the conference room. Men comparing stocks, real estate, and new acquisitions. Halfway through the meeting, someone across the table smirked. "So, Richard," he said, "when's your daughter's IPO? Maybe we should be investing in her instead of your fund." The room chuckled. My father's grip on his pen tightened. He stood slowly, the laughter fading as they realized he wasn't joining in. "I used to think I understood success," he said evenly. "Degrees suits connections. Things you can frame and hang on a wall." But watching her last night, he glanced around the table, meeting every pair of eyes. I realized success isn't what you wear or where you eat dinner. It's what keeps running even when no one believes in it. I was wrong about her. Maybe I was wrong about a lot of things. No one said a word. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air vent. Finally, someone cleared his throat. "Well," he said carefully, "sounds like she got her drive from somewhere." My father gave a small, humorless smile. Maybe from watching what not to become. The meeting ended early. Outside, he lingered by the elevator, looking out over Boston's skyline, the morning light glinting off the glass towers. He took out his phone, opened CNN's site again, and watched the headline scroll across the ticker one more time. Clara Mitchell, founder and CEO of ClearPath Systems, the woman who built what others doubted. He slipped the phone into his pocket and exhaled slowly. Karma doesn't make noise, it doesn't need to. It just waits for the truth to catch up. The first headline hit on a Wednesday morning freight sync. CEO fires back, ClearPath still has questions to answer. By noon, Evelyn Price was on camera standing behind a podium in a pale gray suit, her voice smooth and careful. "We welcome competition," she said. "But true transparency takes more than a good interview. ClearPath still hasn't shown proof that their emission data holds up under independent scrutiny." Her words were surgical, meant to sound reasonable but loaded like bullets. Reporters nodded, typing eagerly. Within hours, the media split into camps. Some called it a desperate attempt to claw back attention. Others wondered aloud if ClearPath had gone quiet because there was something to hide. I watched the coverage from my office, the sound low. Marcus paced behind me. "She's doing exactly what you said she would, muddying the water so no one knows who to trust." "Then we make the water clear," I said. He stopped pacing. "How? If they want transparency, we'll give them more of it than they know what to do with." The next day I called a full staff meeting. My team filled the glass conference room. Engineers, analysts, PR staff, logistics coordinators. The tension was heavy, but no one looked scared. They were waiting. "We're opening our doors," I said. "Every audit, every data set, every client approval letter, we'll make it public. We'll invite CNN to see everything start to finish. We're not hiding behind statements. We're showing the world what real transparency looks like." Emma raised her hand. "You're serious, full access?" "Yes," I said. "Full access." There was a murmur of surprise, but then someone clapped. Then another. Within seconds, the whole room joined in. 2 days later, the CNN crew returned. This time, there were no staged lights, no rehearsed interviews. They filmed in the warehouses, following workers as forklifts moved pallets and screens, updated live efficiency data. They spoke with engineers about code reviews, with clients about measurable impact. The segment was called Inside ClearPath. Watching them film felt strange, like letting strangers read a diary, but also freeing. We'd spent years being invisible. Maybe it was time to be seen properly. When the broadcast aired that weekend, it wasn't glossy or dramatic. It was real. It showed a warehouse floor manager saying their system cut our waste by 18%, and one of our engineers explaining data checks in plain language. Jenna's closing line stayed with me. Sometimes truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs light. By Monday, the narrative had shifted. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline, "Freight Sink Under Pressure After ClearPath Opens Books to Public." CNBC called our move a masterclass in corporate honesty. Hashtags spread across social media, #ClearPath, Truth, and The Quiet Fighter. But the biggest moment came when Jenna called again. "We're hosting a live talk show next week in New York. Women Who Lead? We'd like you to be part of the panel." I hesitated. "Live, yes," she said. "Unedited. Just you, your story, and the truth." I smiled. "Then count me in." The studio lights felt hotter than the first time I'd sat under them. 3 other women sat beside me, each from different industries, each with her own war stories. But when the segment turned to me, the room seemed to hold its breath. Jenna leaned forward slightly. "Clara," she said a year ago, "some called you an overhyped founder. 2 months ago, they called you a fraud. What do you want to say to them now?" I looked straight at her, then at the camera. "Thank you," I said. Because every time someone doubted me, I learned to trust myself a little more. Every accusation made me double-check my integrity. Every insult reminded me what I stood for. The audience was silent for a moment. Then applause broke out. Jenna smiled. "That's an answer I think a lot of people needed to hear." During the commercial break, she leaned over. "You know, you've become something of a symbol. I never wanted to be one," I said. "I just wanted to do my job." "Maybe that's why it works," she replied. After the show, I stepped out into the New York air, humid and alive. My phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from colleagues, strangers, even investors I hadn't heard from in years. The hashtag #ClearPathTruth was trending across the country. Back in Boston, Freight Sink's board held an emergency meeting. By evening, every major outlet reported the same thing: Evelyn Price resigns. Amid transparency scandal, I didn't celebrate. I just sat in my hotel room by the window, the city lights blinking below, and turned on CNN one last time. Jenna's voice came through the screen again. In an era of noise and spin, one company chose a different approach: radical transparency. And as it turns out, transparency might just be the strongest weapon truth has. I watched in silence, the reflection of my own face superimposed over the footage of our team. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't anger or exhaustion. It was peace, not the kind you announce by, the quiet kind that comes when the storm has finally spent itself. That night in Boston, my father sat alone in his study, the blue glow of his iPad reflecting off the glass of an untouched whiskey. The sound of the CNN replay filled the quiet room, my voice calm and even carrying from the screen. He'd already watched the segment twice, but he hit play again as if repetition might make it easier to understand. On screen, I was sitting beneath studio lights answering Jenna's question with a steady look. "Thank you," I said, because every doubt taught me to believe in myself a little more. He paused the video right there. The frame froze on my face, my eyes clear, my shoulders relaxed. It was a look he didn't recognize. The daughter who used to wait for his approval had vanished, replaced by someone who no longer needed it. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. For a long time he said nothing. Then in a low, cracked voice, he whispered, "You're not pretending anymore, are you?" The memory came to him uninvited. The night 5 years ago when he'd shouted those words across the kitchen. "Stop pretending to be successful." He remembered the way I'd stood there silent, my hand on the doorknob, my face blank except for the hurt I wouldn't show. I hadn't said a word. I'd just walked out. Now, staring at the still image on the screen, he repeated the line softer this time, almost to himself. "You're not pretending. You're actually successful." He swallowed hard, rubbing a hand over his face. The whiskey sat untouched beside him. The silence in the house felt different tonight. Not peaceful, but heavy. Linda appeared at the doorway wearing her reading glasses, holding a book she hadn't been reading. "You're still up?" she asked. He turned the iPad toward her. "She was on this talk show. Did you see it?" "I did," she said, walking over. "I watched it live." He gestured to the screen. She looks different. She looks like herself, Linda said gently. He exhaled. I taught her to work hard to never quit. I thought that was enough. Linda set her book down and put a hand on his shoulder. You taught her discipline, Richard. But you forgot to teach her trust. You never trusted that she could succeed on her own terms. He didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the paused image of me on the screen. I wanted to protect her, he said quietly, but all I did was make her feel small. She's never been small, Linda said. You just couldn't see how big she already was. He let out a breath that trembled at the edges. Then, without looking at her, he said, Do you think she'll answer if I call her Linda? Said, but don't apologize with words. Apologize with listening. He hesitated for a long moment, then picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found my name. The screen reflected in his glasses, glowing like a small confession. He pressed call. I answered after 2 rings. Hey, Dad? Clara? His voice was rough, uncertain. I watched your interview. I figured you would, I said. A pause. You were good. You looked confident. Thank you. He hesitated, then asked, What you're building? I'd like to understand it. Really understand it. Would you let me come see your office? The question caught me off guard. For years, all he'd done was dismiss what I built. Hearing him ask to see it felt strange, almost unreal. There's a strategy meeting Thursday afternoon, I said finally. We're presenting the new logistics model to the engineers. If you're free, you can sit in. I'll be there, he said. The words came out quickly, almost eager before he caught himself. If that's okay. It's okay, I said softly. Another pause. Longer this time, filled with things neither of us knew how to say. Then I heard him exhale. Good night, Clara. Good night, Dad. When the call ended, I sat in my apartment phone, still in my hand. Part of me wanted to believe this was the start of something new. Another part wasn't sure if he meant it. I decided not to think about it yet. In Boston, he didn't move for a while after hanging up. The call had left him shaken, unsure of what to do with the guilt still sitting in his chest. Finally, he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city was quiet. Streetlights shimmered on wet pavement, the reflections splitting and bending against the glass. He rested a hand on the cold window pane, looking out over the skyline. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt like a student starting late. Under his breath, he said it aloud. Barely louder than the hum of the city below. It's time I learn how to be her father. He turned back toward the iPad. The screen had gone dark, but his own reflection stared back. Older, smaller, humbled, he picked up the glass of whiskey, thought about it, and set it down again, untouched. Then he walked out of the study, leaving the light on as if the house itself needed a little illumination too. Thursday came bright and cold, the kind of New York morning that made everything look sharper. I got to the office earlier than usual, and told the front desk to expect a guest. When my father arrived, I saw him through the glass wall of the lobby. He stood for a moment just inside the entrance, taking it in, the rows of sleek chairs, the massive glass panel etched with our logo, and the digital display behind the reception desk flashing CNN trending #1, the woman they all doubted. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically. He was still tall, shoulders broad, but smaller in the way people seem when they're no longer sure of the ground beneath them. Mr. Mitchell, the receptionist said kindly, welcome to ClearPath Systems. He gave an awkward smile. Thank you. When I stepped out to greet him, he looked both proud and nervous, like he wasn't sure how to stand. You weren't kidding, he said, glancing around. This place, it's impressive. Come on, I said. I'll show you around. We started in the operations center, the heart of the company. The space was alive with motion walls of screens displaying real-time shipping routes, predictive models, live data feeds. Rows of engineers and analysts monitored every glowing number, their focus unbroken, even as I walked by. My father stopped just past the threshold. "Good Lord," he said softly. A young engineer noticed us and nodded respectfully. "Morning, Clara?" Then, recognizing him, she added, "You must be her dad." He blinked, startled. "I suppose I am." "She's amazing," the engineer said. "She understands every part of this system. I've never worked for a CEO who actually reads code line by line." He smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of realization. Sounds like she's the real deal. We kept walking. I showed him how data from hundreds of warehouses streamed into our platform, how we used AI to forecast shipping delays before they happened. He asked questions, mostly to fill the silence. "How many people work here?" 150 now, I said, "across 3 offices, and you built this from scratch." "With help. I didn't do it alone." He nodded, still looking around, still trying to connect this place with the image he'd carried of me for years, the dropout, the disappointment. We stopped at the far end of the operations center where a floor-to-ceiling window overlooked the East River. The afternoon light cut through the haze, throwing reflections of data screens across the glass. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You built all this. Without me." I looked at him. "Not without you. I built it using what you taught me. Discipline, persistence, the belief that failure isn't final. You just didn't recognize it when you saw it." He swallowed, hard eyes glistening. "I thought I was protecting you from disappointment." "I know," I said, "but you were protecting me from a life I didn't want." He nodded, struggling for words. "I was wrong, Clara. About everything. About you. I know that too." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was quiet, calm, like both of us had finally stopped fighting a war neither of us could win. One of the engineers nearby turned in her chair and said softly, almost to herself, "That's her dad." Another replied, "Yeah, can you imagine? Must be wild seeing this for the first time." He heard them and smiled faintly. "They respect you," he said. "They should," I said, half joking. "They built this with me." He looked at me again, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "You know, I used to think success was about power. But this is something else. You didn't build an empire. You built a purpose." I didn't answer. I just watched him as he took it all in. The hum of machines, the quiet efficiency of the team, the pulse of something alive and honest. When we finally turned back toward the hallway, he stopped again. "Clara," he said, "I'm proud of you. Not because of the interviews or the money or the headlines. I'm proud because you saw something right and followed it. Because you did the hard thing." I smiled. "That's funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you." He raised an eyebrow. "About me. About the version of you who taught me not to quit no matter how many people doubted me. I guess I took that lesson to heart." He let out a shaky laugh. "Seems you did." We walked to the elevator in silence. Before he stepped in, he turned back one more time. "You really did it," he said. "You proved me wrong." "I wasn't trying to prove you wrong," I said. "I was trying to prove myself right." The elevator doors closed slowly between us. I stood there until the hum faded. Later, I went back to the window at the end of the hall. The sun had dipped low, washing the skyline in soft orange. The reflections of the screens danced faintly on the glass, merging with the city lights beginning to glow outside. My father's words echoed in my mind, not the apology, but the simple truth behind it. He didn't have to say I'm sorry. He'd already said something better, I see you. I stood there until the city turned gold, and for the first time that light didn't feel distant. It felt earned. A month later, the CNN segment had surpassed 20 million views. My inbox looked like an avalanche by speaking, invitations, partnership offers, congratulations from people who hadn't returned my calls in years. Every major outlet had run their own version of the story, most using the same line, Clara Mitchell, the woman they all doubted. It was strange watching my life turn into a headline. Overnight, I'd gone from an invisible founder to a symbol, A female leader redefining America's industrial backbone according to one paper. I wasn't sure if I liked the label, but I understood it. People needed something to believe in, and for once I wasn't the cautionary tale. Then the email came from Stanford. Dear Ms. Mitchell, the university would be honored to invite you as keynote speaker for the 2025 commencement ceremony. Your story exemplifies the spirit of innovation and perseverance we strive to instill in our students. I stared at the message for a long time. Stanford, the place I'd walked away from 5 years earlier, the choice that had branded me a failure, was now asking me to return. On the day of the ceremony, the campus looked exactly as I remembered it. Palm trees swaying sandstone arches glowing under the California sun. Rows of folding chairs lined the courtyard filled with thousands of graduates and their families. The stage was wrapped in crimson banners. As I stood behind the podium waiting for the applause to quiet, I caught sight of my father and mother sitting together near the front. He looked older, smaller somehow, but proud in a way that didn't need words. I took a breath and began. 5 years ago, I sat in this courtyard wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. I'd dropped out of this university to chase an idea that didn't have a name yet. People told me I was naive, impulsive, arrogant. Some even called me the warehouse girl. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. I didn't pick the easy path, I continued, but I picked the one that made me free. Freedom isn't about walking away from failure. It's about being willing to face it. I didn't want a title. I wanted to build something real, something that worked. And along the way I learned that belief doesn't always come from others first. Sometimes you have to build it yourself, line by line, day by day. The courtyard was silent except for the wind. Then the first person stood to clap, then another, until the entire audience was on their feet. Thousands of hands applauding, the sound swelling around me like a wave. For a moment I let myself feel it. Not pride exactly, but peace. The kind that comes when you realize the struggle was worth every bruise. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed the press area asking for photos and quotes. I smiled politely, said a few words about innovation and perseverance, and excused myself. Back in the green room, my phone buzzed with new notifications. American Enterprise had just published a full feature, The Woman They All Doubted. The headline sat beside a still from the CNN interview. My face mid-sentence, the caption reading, Clara Mitchell, founder of ClearPath Systems, is redefining leadership through humility and persistence. Scrolling further, I saw another post, this one from Ethan Brooks, the first investor who'd rejected me 6 years ago. He'd written, I once told a young founder her idea was too niche to matter. Today her company moves 1/3 of the nation's supply chain. I was wrong. Clara Mitchell reminds us all that vision isn't always loud. It's often patient. I didn't comment, didn't share it. I just smiled faintly and closed the app. A text appeared a few minutes later, from Olivia. You've made the whole family rethink everything. I mean that. I'm proud of you. I typed back. No one needs to win inside a family. Live. We just need to stop keeping score. There was no reply, but I knew she'd read it. Later that afternoon, I walked across the campus quad toward the exit. The press had cleared out, the crowd had thinned. The late sunlight turned the buildings gold, and ahead of me a poster caught my eye. It was part of the CNN campaign they'd launched after the talk show. My photo from the interview, eyes focused, captioned in bold letters, Resilience is Success. I stopped in front of it. For a long time I just stood there watching the way the light hit the print. The face, staring back at me, didn't look like someone who'd been doubted anymore. She looked steady, sure. I reached out and brushed my fingers lightly across the edge of the poster, not as a gesture of pride, but of closure. Behind me, the bell tower chimed. Students streamed past, laughing, taking photos, beginning their own stories. I turned away from the poster and kept walking, the sound of their joy fading behind me. It felt like the world had finally caught up, not to my success, but to the truth I'd known all along. The first snow of the season dusted the rooftops outside my window. turning Brooklyn quiet and pale. My apartment was warm, though the radiator clicked every few minutes like it was protesting the cold. The TV played softly in the background, a year-end special. Top stories of the year. I wasn't really watching until I heard my own name. And at number 2, the anchor said, "Our interview with Clara Mitchell, the ClearPath Systems CEO, whose story of resilience and transparency redefined what leadership looks like in 2025. The screen flashed with clips from the talk show, the warehouse footage, the Stanford speech. My voice filled the room again, distant and familiar all at once. I smiled faintly and reached for my phone just as it buzzed. A text from Marcus. "We just closed the deal with Pacific Freight. That makes 25 Fortune 500 clients. Congratulations, boss." I typed back, "Tell the team they earned it." A few seconds later, another message popped up. This one from my mother. A photo came through my father sitting on their couch, surrounded by neighbors watching the same broadcast. His head tilted toward the screen, his expression soft, proud. Underneath the image, Mom had written, "He told them, that's my daughter." For a long moment, I just stared at the photo. My chest tightened, but not with pain. Something gentler, quieter. The sound of the TV faded behind me as I looked around my apartment. The same small kitchen, the same dented coffee table. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I sat down at my desk, the same one I'd bought used when ClearPath was still an idea that didn't have investors or headlines or employees, just me and a few lines of code. I opened my journal, the one I hadn't written in for months. For a minute, I didn't know where to start. Then the words came easily flowing, like something I'd been holding in too long. "I used to think recognition was victory," I wrote. "But it isn't. Victory is choosing to keep going when no one believes you, when the world laughs, when silence becomes your only witness. Success was never about proving them wrong. It was about never giving up on the truth I knew inside me." I paused, looking down at the ink drying on the page, and added one last line. "CNN didn't make me successful. It just made people finally listen." I closed the journal and leaned back, letting the quiet settle. Outside, the snow had started again, light flakes swirling past the window like ash from a fire that had finally burned out. An hour later, I grabbed my coat and keys. It was early morning, still the city just beginning to wake. The air smelled like cold steel and coffee. My old Subaru sat by the curb, speckled with snow, but reliable as ever. When I turned the key, the engine coughed once, then started the same sound that had once carried me across every state line of doubt. The streets were half empty, the sky a pale gray that made the bridges glow. By the time I reached the office, the sun had begun to rise, turning the East River into a ribbon of silver. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw them through the windows. Marcus, Emma, the engineers, the analysts, all of them gathered near the entrance. Someone must have told them I was coming. They were clapping when I stepped out of the car, their breath fogging in the cold air. Morning boss Marcus called his grin wide. I laughed, shaking my head. "You're here early." "So are you?" he said. "We figured you'd want to see the dashboard go live for the new client." I followed them inside. The operations floor glowed with color. The screens alive with movement. The heartbeat of a company that once existed only in my imagination. As I walked past the rows of desks, faces turned toward me, smiling. It wasn't admiration I saw there. It was something deeper. Respect, belonging, belief. The kind I'd spent years chasing in all the wrong places. I stopped near the main window, where the morning sun poured in. The city outside was humming now, the world moving again, and for the first time in a long time I felt perfectly aligned with it. Behind me, Marcus said softly, "Hard to believe this all started in that little studio apartment." I smiled. "Not that hard. I can still hear the radiator." The room erupted in laughter. Someone turned up the radio, and the sound of it filled the space. Bright, unburdened, alive. I looked at them, all my team, my people, and let the moment wash over me. In the background, the TV in the break room was still playing the CNN special. My voice came through one last time. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives quietly in the moment people finally start listening. I stood there for a long time watching the sunlight stretch across the office floor, catching on the faces of the people who had believed before anyone else did. If you've ever been doubted, don't waste your breath shouting. Let your work speak. Let your truth do the talking. Because in the end, what's right doesn't need to scream. It just waits, steady and patient for the world to finally hear it.